Welcome in to another Coinage Chat. I'm the host of Coinage, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studio here on a very big day. Not only is it drop day, the first chance to co-own Coinage with us via our NFTs, but I'm excited to be chatting today with an old friend, one of the biggest voices in the Bitcoin space and the crypto space writ large, Anthony Pompliano, joining us for the first time here on Coinage. Pomp, thanks so much for hopping on, man.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Super excited to talk.
Yeah, it's been a while. I don't know. Anyone watching or listening to this would know that, we've chatted before on Yahoo Finance, I think a half dozen times, but it's the first time that we're chatting since all the dominoes in the crypto world really fell in 2022. So there's a lot to talk about on this chat, and I think a lot that people want to hear about in terms of how you're thinking about the space, myself included. I'm quite interested to hear about how it's impacted you as a person who was impacted by it all in 2022 as well. So my first question, just to kind of get into it, Pomp, is, after all the stuff that went down in the crypto space, how are you feeling about it?
I feel great. I think that there's bull and bear cycles in every industry. And for people who've been around for a while and have seen previous bear markets, you realize that right now is when a lot of value gets created. And then in the bull markets is when it kind of gets captured. And if there's one thing that we learned over the last 18 months or so, it's that there are certain parts of this industry that are incredibly resilient. And if you look at Bitcoin specifically, hash rate is up. The number of Bitcoin on-chain addresses with a certain amount of Bitcoin is up near all-time highs. Continued adoption of the Lightning Network, and many other kind of what I would consider underlying fundamentals. But through it all, I think actually the most important thing is we can look at all that data, but really it's just that systems like Bitcoin executed exactly as they were designed to. They don't care what's going on with the Fed. They don't care about centralized companies surviving, thriving, failing. Ultimately, is just these decentralized systems are incredibly resilient. It's important that they are. And so seeing these stress tests and them not only survive, but I would argue thrive, is an important data point that I think drives confidence, not only in kind of the digital native environment or audience, but also with Wall Street, with corporations, and ultimately with nation states and central banks over time as well.
Yeah, it's been interesting to kind of watch, I guess, the narrative of the Bitcoin argument change. We've seen a lot of narratives since you and I have been chatting about all these things. There was a moment in time where everyone thought every company in the world was going to be adding Bitcoin to their balance sheet. We saw that kind of come and go. There was the excitement around El Salvador and what they were doing with Bitcoin as a currency. There's the excitement always, I suppose, at least until there wasn't any excitement around Bitcoin as an inflation hedge. I mean, what do you think the next narrative will be? Or if it'll be kind of an amalgamation of all those things, if you still see those being like the main ones that people should really be paying attention to, or you think there's another one that might come around?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to kind of evaluate this. The first is we can take each one of those arguments in a second and kind of unpack them. But ultimately, an asset like Bitcoin, the beauty is that it serves different purposes for different people, right? If you look in the United States, where the legacy financial system works pretty well, the dollar is fairly stable compared to, let's say, developing nation currencies. The reason why somebody in the United States, which the White House estimates about 15% of the American population has already purchased or interacted with Bitcoin or digital assets, is very different than, let's say, in a developing nation where your currency is failing, you're worried about censorship or other things. And so this idea that a single piece of technology that is not controlled by any individual organization can serve different purposes for different people, I think is important. Now, in terms of the three specific kind of arguments or thesis, narratives, whatever you want to call them, let's just go one by one. So in terms of the inflation hedge, I actually think Bitcoin was the best inflation hedge. And I think a common misconception around these inflation hedge assets is that people think that they should be performing really well once inflation hits. But actually, an inflation hedge should run in value before the inflation gets there, right? Investors move their capital in anticipation of inflation. They don't wait for the inflation to happen and then move their capital. And so people like Paul Tudor Jones, Stanley Druckenmiller, many others on Wall Street, but also many people in the Bitcoin community, I think rightfully identified that Bitcoin was going to outperform as we moved into a high inflation environment. And it obviously did that. Now, the reason why Bitcoin crashed, if you look at it through that narrative, is because the Fed came out and said they're going to destroy demand. So they said, we basically are going to get inflation under control. Bitcoin sells off in advance of that. Investors, again, moving back into whether it was cash, treasuries, real estate, value stocks, whatever it may be. And so, from that standpoint, like people are anticipating inflation, they move into an inflation hedge asset. Inflation shows up, that asset benefits from it, and then inflation is going to go away, so people move out of the asset. Like that is the definition of an inflation hedge.
So
And
does
I
that
will
mean
call out.
that would that mean that it's a bit of a tough position for Bitcoin to be in now then, if inflation seemingly, as we're watching it kind of come back under control? I mean, how does that maybe change the aspect there?
Well, I don't think that inflation is going to come back under control, and I don't think it has, right? I actually even think with negative inflation, let's say by the summer, so people like Barry Sternlicht, many other macro investors are predicting that we could see negative inflation by the summertime. But remember, that's year over year change. That doesn't mean that prices came back down. That doesn't mean that the devaluation of the currency ultimately will come back down either. And I think really what we're talking about here is a short-term narrative versus a long-term trend.
Yeah.
And the short-term narrative of, high inflation, not high inflation, will be debated, for years and years to come. But ultimately, we have $31 trillion of national debt, and we have no ability to pay it back, no ability to service that debt in any meaningful way for the long term. And then we have these mandatory spending that we have to do on things like Social Security, Medicaid, et cetera. And so naturally, the only way for the United States not to default is we will have to continue to raise the debt limit, and we will have to monetize that debt by devaluing the currency. And so you're going to have a persistent multi-decade higher inflation environment, regardless of what the official numbers say. And Bitcoin will be a big beneficiary of that trend, but so will other assets. And I think it's important. One of the things that is kind of a prevalent argument in the Bitcoin community that I don't necessarily agree with is that Bitcoin is the only asset. Right.
Yeah.
I think that real estate investors will do well. I think other types of assets will do well also, but Bitcoin will be one of the assets that is a great beneficiary from that long term.
I want to get into the other crypto assets too that might be a play as well. But on Bitcoin, before we move on from it, I mean, that's an interesting one. And I feel like right now, even the narrative there is being challenged in terms of things that are getting added to Bitcoin. We can talk about that. We see utility as a big thing that people want now as crypto kind of evolves into this next chapter. Obviously, as a community-owned show where people can buy the NFTs, come on the show with us, and weigh in on what we cover, that's kind of our piece of utility here. But specifically with Bitcoin, it's been interesting to see NFTs be added with Ordinals, the latest project there. The idea being that, okay, all these other things can support it. Why not Bitcoin? I'm curious to get your take on something like that, where people are adding NFTs to Bitcoin. It's kind of split the Bitcoin community. What do you think? Are NFTs on Bitcoin a net good or net bad?
NFTs were started on Bitcoin. So anyone who's arguing against it, frankly, should probably go study history. On top of that, people like Hal Finney, who are held up by the Bitcoin community as being these ultimate Bitcoiners, he was talking about digital trading cards back in the 90s. So I think that, what really has happened is there's been a bifurcation in the Bitcoin community. You have people who I think are technologists who fundamentally believe that the technology can solve real world problems. These are people who have been around for a long time. But then now there's this like new, proportion of the population or kind of segment of the population. Many of them actually were the people who were selling ICOs and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And they've now kind of try to co-opt the Bitcoin narrative and create a religion. And I think that that's, one, kind of a waste of time, but also two, I think it's dangerous. When I look at something like Bitcoin, it's a piece of technology. That technology happens to be a decentralized network. That network is not owned by anyone, and it is solving real world problems, right? It is digital sound money that is coming to the world that is able to solve, from a first principle standpoint, probably the most important problem and kind of the most foundational problem in society, which is the corruption of money. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean that Bitcoin solves everything. That also doesn't mean that it's a religion. If you want to apply a purity test to Bitcoin, then I think that you're just wasting your time. You're confusing motion with progress. And so everyone that, I spend time with and I think is building real businesses, real companies, they aren't, trying to kind of fake it till you make it. They're not trying to just put wrappers and try to find shortcuts and things like that. All of these people are actively building all around Bitcoin, on top of Bitcoin. They're using Bitcoin. They're doing all of this. And what you find is that the people who have been building in the Bitcoin ecosystem, whether it's people like Eric Voorhees, Jesse Powell, if you even look at some of the Bitcoin companies like Strike and River, these individuals are very open-minded. They are very much looking at how do we solve the problem. Bitcoin is a great tool to do that. But there's another faction of the population that I think is more interested in being right than actually solving the problem. And regardless of the industry, I think that those people end up kind of being tourists. They'll eventually go and find something else to yell and scream about. And so the real builders, you're not likely to see them engaging in that stuff on Twitter, and they're more likely just to be focused on solving problems.
Yeah, we had Eric Voorhees on an episode. We sat down with him in our first season to kind of discuss some of that as well, in terms of whether or not, what is the crypto revolution, the Bitcoin revolution, really all about. And I guess that's kind of an important thing when we think about, other projects that have popped up. And that's something that always interests me about kind of like the way you look at crypto, because obviously, you're heavy on Bitcoin. I'm curious if like anything now, as we see, this conversation around NFTs and Bitcoin, the network, if it's changed kind of the way you look past it to other things like Ethereum and the rest of projects in crypto, if you're interested in those any more than the last time we chatted, and what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, I mean, look, most people forget. I think it was in 2020, like August or September. I wrote a piece. I said, look, digital art is going to be the next big thing. And I was one of, I think, myself and Jason Williams, we probably bought the second NFT piece ever created by Fewocious. And we saw this very early. And we didn't care where it happened. I don't care if it happens on Bitcoin, on Ethereum, or anywhere else. It was just very clear that the idea of taking what was art and bringing it onto this digital ecosystem was going to be big. And then obviously NFTs went and they exploded and kind of became this huge industry onto their own. Now, at the same time, I've been very clear that I think what happens in these industries is people get really excited about something that could work, and they run around and they do all kinds of crazy stuff with it that ends up being unsustainable and frankly, just a waste of time from a value creation perspective. There's entertainment purposes or whatever. And so there's a recent article, I think it's in Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, I can't remember, that's talking about all the AI coins or AI related coins and NFTs. And what basically people have done is they're like, okay, well, let's take crypto, let's take AI, let's put them together, and like that'll cause some people to FOMO and prices will go up. Like that's just like not interesting whatsoever to me.
Yeah.
And so if you bring it back to kind of like NFTs as a example, again, NFTs were created on Bitcoin. And there's a lot of people who are in the Bitcoin community and they don't like want to talk about that, or they say it's, bullshit or whatever. But I always bring it back to, if you yell and you scream about all this stuff being scams and worthless, et cetera, well, then it's kind of hypocritical to not sit there and say, okay, we have Bitcoin layer 1, we have Lightning, and then we have Taro or Taro, depending how you want to pronounce it, coming out, where they're explicitly saying that they want to create other assets on top of Bitcoin. So is it that the assets are not actually valuable, or is it that you don't like where they're being built?
Yeah.
And I just come from the mindset of like, you can spend all the time in the world yelling and screaming, complaining, and kind of using the internet to create a ruckus, or just compete in the free market. And I think that Bitcoin, like that is the one thing I always point to, regardless of who I'm talking to, whether they're in the kind of Bitcoin crypto world, whether I'm talking to somebody who works at a central bank or somebody who works on Wall Street. I say, listen, in a full free market, Bitcoin has been the winner, and Bitcoin continues to be the winner. It is out competing. And I think that's a really, really valuable thing. And frankly, it's one of the only industries in the world where it's still a pretty free market. And to be a winner there is a reason why there is value ascribed to that asset.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because like I remember interviewing you a few years ago now. I guess it's been that long, and it was like, okay, yeah. I mean, Pomp's great at explaining all the Bitcoin stuff, and like, all right, what's going on beyond it? So like, obviously, Bitcoin's kind of what draws people into the space, and then you look at other projects, and I was always like, I wonder why people aren't talking more about things beyond Bitcoin. And then we saw what happened. You mentioned projects that may kind of be, replicating some of the fundamentals of Bitcoin, but then also not really built as properly. And I think 2022 proved that. You mentioned projects kind of taking advantage of some of those morals and themes. And I think there's a baker's dozen you can really choose from in 2022. And we can talk about that because, that's part of the thing that I feel like a lot of people who were in crypto, who went deeper and deeper, feel jaded. I don't know if you feel jaded. I myself, I lost some money last year. I feel a little jaded personally on just projects. And it's interesting because you and I both, I guess, technically, like we overlapped a little bit. The last time I think I texted you was about Terra when we were at Coinage, kind of working on our exclusive around that, talking to Dokwon and what went wrong with Terra. And, you and I both saw it as a project that was intriguing because of what it was using Bitcoin for in terms of, backing their algorithmic stablecoin. And then that collapsed, and we saw all the dominoes go off in 2022. I'm curious how you might feel jaded in all of that, and some of the collapses as well that you saw play out.
I'm not jaded at all. I mean, look, it was very clear to me, right? I think I even explicitly talked to Do Kwon about it when I interviewed him. I wrote about it. It was like, look, algorithmic stablecoins had never worked before. There was this great, I think it's like a 15 or 20 page white paper as to why they hadn't previously worked before. And when I wrote about it, I linked to it and said, here's the reason why these haven't previously worked. And a lot of it was to do with the algorithms that would hold the peg. Sometimes it was with other types of assets they were being pegged to. Each one kind of had their own issue. But no one had ever tried to create an algorithmic stablecoin that was backed by Bitcoin. And so the reason why that was interesting is because you could see if it worked, eventually central banks or other types of organizations around the world, whether they're private companies or central banks, trying to back their assets with Bitcoin. But at the same time, when I asked Do Kwon, what are the risks? He pretty clearly laid out what he thought the risks were. And, I've always been of the belief that I'm not here to pass judgment. I ask the questions, I put them out there. Anyone can go ahead and audit the work and see what they think. And, ultimately, I think I'm the only person who has, prior to the collapse, Do Kwon on record saying what he thought the risks were. Now, people will agree or disagree with what those risks were, how he described them, whatever. That's for them to do, not for me.
Yeah. Well, that's what we did, because I thought it was interesting. And, you had him on the space, and he basically, I guess, kind of overrepresented some of the stuff around Chai, the payment system. And I think that was interesting because you're right. You had him on record, you were talking with him, and then in retrospect, as we learned in our piece, that, there are some things that I think sometimes are stretched, right, beyond what the public knows.
Well, and I think, there's one idea around like disclosures and like are people saying that they truly believe and they're just wrong. Like being wrong, is one thing, but also there's then the conversation around like, are people being malicious or whatever? And again, each situation is different. And I think people will all have their own personal opinions. But I think another really important part is that like, I publicly talk about it, right? I was having a conversation with him that was recorded that other people could come and kind of audit that work. But at the same time, like, there's a hell of a lot of people in the Bitcoin community that I talked to personally in group settings, in private, that were very interested to see if it worked or not. All of those people got very quiet and kind of backpedaled quickly once it all unraveled. And so I think that, there's this level of kind of social proof that people want. It's a natural human nature thing where they basically want to always be seen as being right. I'm not really interested in that. What I'm interested in is figuring out what the truth is. I'm trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And so I'm happy to talk to people in public about it and get them on record.
I feel the same way. Yeah, I feel the same way. I also think you melted our space, so we had to restart it, and I don't know if you're in it. So if you wanna hop into that, we can start having you in this new space. Twitter's been really having a go lately, I think, honestly. But yeah, I feel the same way in terms of like, okay, obviously in Web3, in crypto, like all of these things are being built. There are going to be problems. It's on people to kind of look into them, and obviously sometimes people might stretch the truth. And you talked about some of those other projects in terms of where did things go wrong. I'm curious to get your take because, we got attacked. I got attacked personally as someone who talked about Terra and like what it could do. And, in retrospect, when things don't work out, people are like, hey. And I think, watching you brilliantly on CNBC kind of talk about BlockFi and the centralized lenders and what went wrong there, Jim Cramer was like, I love Pomp, but he got me into BlockFi, which reminded me of a conversation that I had with my own dad because I also mentioned BlockFi to him. I feel like a lot of people did. That's another one where it's like,
too, but Jim, if Jim is going to say that, then he has to give me his farm. Because I think he publicly said that he sold his crypto to buy a farm.
Yeah.
And he made a bunch of money and he bought a farm in Pennsylvania. So if that's true, then maybe we just call it Jim and Pomp's farm. And we can co-own it.
I had Florian Zach on my show at Yahoo before, like I thought, it was a sound product. It worked up until it didn't. And obviously, again, a lot of leverage in the system in 2022. But I was an investor in BlockFi and I was never on the board. So I'm curious in terms of like what you saw playing out last year, because everyone kind of saw lenders. And again, it's like Celsius, Voyager, BlockFi, like all of these things happened. And you mentioned kind of like mistakes versus like, I guess, misjudging certain things. I mean, when you look at all of that stuff and maybe specifically at BlockFi, like what really happened there, I guess, if you simplify it and everyone's like, hey, what happened in crypto in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to comment obviously on BlockFi specifically as a investor there, but I think when you look at maybe the public narrative, I think it's very clear where people think that there might have been malicious activity versus you're kind of the on the bad end of misjudgment, or there could be bad deals, or there's chain reactions and kind of daisy chain of liquidity. And if you really kind of zoom out and you look at the various organizations that were affected throughout 2022, we have everything from some of the hedge fund blowups earlier in the year. Then you get some of the centralized exchange or lending partners. And then you get some of the things that don't even have retail customers, that are literally just kind of like back end infrastructure that were facilitating some of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was kind of a lot of damage across the industry. But I tend to think that the public very quickly, especially in this industry, they are incredibly good at finding information and starting to identify, like, where does it appear that there was some kind of bad action or malicious behavior versus who kind of just got caught up in the snowball, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's all the commentary and analysis to those individuals, but there's a number of accounts on Twitter who have done a pretty good job of identifying that stuff. And again, I'm of the belief that, like, people are innocent until proven guilty if they're accused of having done something malicious. But I tend to think that we'll see all this kind of roll through the system, and we'll figure out what the details are over the coming months.
Yeah, just in terms of adoption, I wonder if there's one that stands out in terms of like what that does, because we've gone back and forth on institutional adoption, retail adoption. That's what's driving the story in crypto. And obviously, if you have a bunch of lenders like that, you can add Gemini in the mix now with Genesis, and assets, that they put in being now caught up in bankruptcy court. I mean, what does that do really to the dynamics of, you have retail enthusiasm kind of whimpering and the institutional demand kind of in the wake of FTX? What does that look like? So how do you put those pieces together for like the next thing, the next wave that triggers anything in terms of people wanting to come back into the space?
I don't think retail enthusiasm has necessarily waned. I think the social media conversation has waned, which sounds like a kind of a nuanced, nitpicky way to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely, the sentiment on Twitter is much more negative than it has been in previous months or last 18 months or so. But you got to remember, like, Twitter's not real life. Majority of Bitcoiners are not on Twitter. And so if you just think about, it's estimated that anywhere between 150 and 250 million people own Bitcoin or have transacted in Bitcoin. That's like the total monthly active users of Twitter, right? Obviously, they are not all on Twitter. And so when you just go and you look at the data, again, look at kind of wallet on-chain addresses with 0.01, 0.1, or 1 Bitcoin in them, those are all hitting all-time highs, like week over week, month over month. They continue to grow. And so that's just people dollar cost averaging into the asset and acquiring more and more of Bitcoin. When you look at the institutional adoption, there's definitely some kind of cover your ass and career protection stuff going on, where there's a number of institutions that were very hot and heavy on the industry. They're not necessarily going away,
Mm-hmm.
although maybe some of the banking partners, it seems like there's some specific pressure there. But the institutions, I think, are kind of just like, hey, let's push this out a quarter. Let's push this out 2 quarters, right? So kind of 3 to 6 months. We still are committed to this. We still have dedicated teams internally. We're still kind of working on it quietly, but we're not going to go out and bang the drum and be very public about the work that we're doing right now. The kind of environment is not conducive to being able to do that. And so, it's kind of a weird thing where, yes, the Twitter sentiment is different. Also, that Twitter sentiment kind of bleeds over, and that's a proxy for kind of what the sentiment is inside of these institutions is. But the majority of Bitcoiners are not on Twitter, and what we see on chain is just that there's more and more people adopting the asset. And I think that ends up being a net positive over the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who hope that's the case as we kind of see 2023 come in and start to see that narrative. I feel like some people that we've talked to on this show, at least on Coinage, saying that the bottoming's kind of there. You and I have talked about price before in terms of how these cycles go. Are you confident enough to say, okay, this could be it, out of the woods and moving into that next phase?
I have no clue. I frankly, I hope that it's not the bottom, so that people can still continue to dollar cost average into the asset. One of the things that I've talked, I think, with you about and many others is when you first learn about this technology, there's really 2 things that fascinate people. One is if you're a technologist, if maybe you're into computer science or networking or whatever, there's a lot of people who become fascinated with the idea of a decentralized network that's been able to reach this level of kind of global penetration and security and all those things, right? So there's definitely some people who come into it from a technical perspective, and they really are amazed at the technical feat that's been accomplished here. But most people come in because of price, right? And there's some element of like, I think I can make money. I think that it's a financial asset. I think that I can get rich quick, whatever it is.
Hmm.
And I think it's okay just for us to say, look, there's right now currently three main use cases for Bitcoin, right? I think that there is a store value aspect that's been widely covered. I think that there is a growing medium of exchange use case, but also one of the big use cases of Bitcoin and other digital assets has been speculation. And I don't think that's a negative thing to talk about. The same thing is what the stock market does, or for many real estate investors, or even in bonds, right? People are speculating on price movements. And so what we know in the Bitcoin world is that price ends up being one of the proxies for user adoption. When the price goes up, there are way more users that come in. Now, when the price goes down, some of them leave, but there's usually a net gain. And that's definitely what we've seen over the last 2 years. The numbers that I saw that really fascinated me were, it was estimated that approximately 50% of all people in the Bitcoin community were new after 2020. So if you think about that, the first, call it 10 to 12 years of Bitcoin made up 50%. And then in the last 2 years, we got 50% of the community. And so when you see that happening, like those people are showing up mainly because the price went up. The media was talking about it. Their friends were talking about it. And so they said, what is this?
Hmm.
And so I think that it really now is a exercise of how do we take those individuals who showed up because of price or because of this, like, I think I can get rich here, and start to teach them. What is the technology? Why is it important? What are the problems it can solve? How does it work, right? Who is going to benefit from the adoption of this asset? All the kind of like underlying fundamental non-price conversations.
Yeah.
That's really the work that gets done now in a bear market. And what you find is that some of those people who showed up because they thought they were going to get rich will turn into what I think is more traditionally considered like a quote unquote Bitcoiner, whatever that's supposed to mean at this point.
Yeah.
To understand that underlying story.
Yeah, I feel like speculation is an interesting thing, just in terms of how it can drive the narrative. It can maybe drive the narrative in a way that gets away from the truth. For us here at Coinage, what we're all about is kind of letting our community weigh in on what that truth is. But I'd be curious, for someone who's been on kind of mainstream media. I was at CNBC before. You've been on CNBC many times. You know the mainstream media well. In terms of the narrative that they kind of talk about, I'm curious if you think that they are ever going to be the type that could talk about it without being kind of dismissive of it when price doesn't go up. What your experience has been in kind of dealing with that.
I don't think there's a one size fits all, right? I think that there's some people who they really believe in the technology and in the assets, and they have a very specific view of the world. I think there's some people who are going to be pessimistic no matter what happens. Bitcoin could be $1 gazillion and they're still going to be pessimistic on it, right? And say it's not going to work and the whole thing. And there's everyone in between, including I would put most of the mainstream media in kind of this like cautiously optimistic position where they're not really a bull, but they're also not like a perma bear either. I think the perma bears kind of get the brunt of the response from the community because it's so egregious when they say certain things and they seem so inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
But also I think that, there's definitely a couple of people in the mainstream media who they might as well have laser eyes on and be tweeting all kinds of crazy stuff on Twitter, right? Like they're perma bulls. But I think most of the mainstream media is in this kind of like, okay, let's see what happens here. This is interesting. Obviously there's investors that are talking about it. And like, I don't know. And I think that's healthy. Like I'm not somebody who believes that everyone should be positive. I think that the critics are important. I think that the critiques are important.
Yeah.
And really, as a community, all we can ask for is like we want educated, kind of people who are bullish, but we also want educated critics, and that hopefully will make Bitcoin better over the long run. And I think it has in the past, and it'll continue to do that in the future.
Well, I think it's fair to say you're a media guy now too, and it's not just crypto you talk about anymore. And and you also made the call to kind of move away from advertisers after 2022 and saying, look, this isn't how I'm going to support my media operation here. I'm going to do it differently. It's been fascinating to watch you kind of do that. Something that we too at Coinage here are trying to find different models versus I think what had been crypto sponsoring a lot of things. And yeah, I don't know if there's a takeaway there for you making that pivot.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm busy. I got a lot of shit going on. I try to focus on the things that are most important. And frankly, there's kind of an element of like when you're dealing with just constant things that are frankly are a waste of your time.
Yeah.
You're just like, let me take this, put this to the side, and focus on things that are most important. And then also, we're not shy about the fact that like we have a specific skill set, we have a specific kind of muscle memory and operating ability that most people don't have who do some sort of media endeavor. And so, I've never really thought of it as a business. I've always thought of it just as an ability for me to learn. And that's kind of steered us well. And so, really, it's just like get rid of distractions, focus on what's important. And the beautiful thing is that people love to yell and scream and do all kinds of crazy stuff during bear markets, usually because they're just bored. But we've been here for years and years and years, and we'll just keep doing our thing. And I'm not worried about much else.
Yeah. Well, listen, I know you are busy. I appreciate you coming on here to take the time to chat with us. I mean, us as a media organization trying to get into the truth in crypto as well. We've been watching your stuff, and to have you on launch day as we drop our NFTs and let people call on our show. Like, honestly, thank you for taking the time to hop on with us, Pomp.
Absolutely. No, love what you guys are doing. Thanks so much for having me, and happy to do it whenever.